And good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I'm Daren, Jaime. Coming up tonight here on Perspectives, we take an in-depth look at the issue of domestic violence. As you know, the month of October is Domestic Violence Month, National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we here on the Center Perspectives are devoting our show in dealing with the issue of domestic violence. Our guest in studio today has devoted more than 25 years to public service in New York City. She is currently serving as the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence, where she's responsible for developing and implementing comprehensive policies and programs that reduce domestic violence and increase public awareness. Currently, the Commissioner is working on opening the city's third Family Justice Center right here in the Bronx. We're pleased to be joined by Bronx Commissioner Yolanda B. Jimenez. Welcome to Perspectives.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. As we talk a little bit about domestic violence, we know that this is a Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but we know that all throughout the course of the year, domestic violence continues to go on. For those people who may not be familiar exactly with what domestic violence is, would you care to share?
You know, domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors that one person utilizes to control another person. So it really becomes an issue of power and control. And it can manifest itself in many different ways, where there is physical abuse, where there's verbal abuse, where there's financial, economic abuse, emotional abuse, and where one person really wants to overpower the other person in a sense. Also trying to isolate them, if you will, keep them away from family and friends, humiliate them. I mean, it takes so many forms. It's not just what we think of when we think of domestic violence, that we think of, you know, somebody physically being abused. It's much more than that. Sexual abuse as well.
And we're going to talk about the different kinds of abuse. I want to talk about some numbers, though. When we look at family-related homicides as regards to domestic violence. In the Bronx alone, 18 victims were killed in the Bronx, 70 family-related homicides in 2008. And police responded to literally close to 240,000 domestic violence incidents in 2008, an average of 600 incidents a day.
A day, yes. I mean, domestic violence is still, in this day and age, very pervasive in our society and in our city. The encouraging news, however, is that domestic violence-related crime is going down. In the last 7 years, we've seen a reduction in domestic violence-related crimes by 24%, and we've seen a decrease by 8%. And I know you alluded to the 18 homicides in the Bronx year-to-date. Well, we had almost twice those numbers last year, so we've seen a drop by 43% right here in the borough of the Bronx. But, you know, one homicide, one incident is one too many, obviously.
Obviously so. I want to talk about the different forms of abuse, because so many times we think about domestic violence in just one particular way, but there are many forms. We talked about this earlier. There is the physical abuse. Let's talk about physical abuse.
So there's the physical abuse when one person clearly, you know, tries to hurt someone by either slapping them or punching them or trying to strangulation. And clearly that's something that someone should report and should call the police. It's a crime. I mean, that is a crime. Domestic violence is a crime when it becomes physical, when somebody's physically hurting someone. And in too many cases, they're also in households where children are witnessing the abuse that is taking place. And children can also be at risk of abuse by the hand of the batterer in that household.
In addition to physical abuse, there is that thing that's known as emotional abuse.
So emotional abuse, somebody is embarrassing you in front of your family and friends. They're calling you names. They're putting you down. I mean, that's all clearly emotional abuse. They're telling you that you're not worth anything. They're trying to really put you down at every turn.
Sexual abuse.
Sexual abuse, clearly when someone is abusing someone sexually where they do not want to. You know, there's marital rape when somebody doesn't want to engage in consensual sex and they're forcing themselves on someone.
Financial abuse.
Financial abuse, they may be, if the breadwinner is the one who is causing the abuse in the house, they may be withholding just some of the daily needs, some of the very basic things, such as, you know, bread, milk for children. just some of the very basic things that they may need to provide for in a family, in a household.
And most times people look at the physical abuse, and we know the physical abuse is one of the major forms of domestic violence. But when you really look at the financial abuse, the sexual abuse, and the emotional abuse, that's all domestic violence, and that's still criminal as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's talk about people out there, because obviously there's a lot of help for people out there who are going through this. And how do we look at warning signs for when domestic violence is on the rise, or when something is leading towards going to domestic violence?
Well, it may manifest itself in any one of the situations that we discussed, or type of abuse that we discussed earlier. But when it's in a relationship and one person is clearly trying to take control over the other person in terms of everything that they do on a daily basis, they need to think that this isn't about just, he cares so much for me that he wants to know where I am at every single moment, or doesn't want me to go out, or tells me what to wear and what not to wear. Then you have to start thinking about if this is something that continuously happens, and it can escalate then into something physical, where there's verbal abuse as well. There's somebody who's yelling, cursing at you. All these things need to be taken into account, and you need to assess the situation, because those are not the signs of a healthy relationship.
And obviously healthy relationships are what everybody strives for. We know that it doesn't always happen. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But when you look at our young people, and you look at teenagers in particular, who don't really have the bounds of what a real relationship is, we find in many cases that teens are actually involved in domestic violence at a more prevalent rate.
Yes, and I'm glad you raised the issue of teen dating violence, because unfortunately we are seeing that more and more often in the city, and we're seeing young people that are involved in relationships that clearly are unhealthy, and they don't even know that they're in those relationships, quite frankly. We have developed a healthy relationship training academy where we have young people, so peer trainers. They go out to schools, they go out to community groups, and they talk to young people not only about what an unhealthy relationship looks like, because they'll talk to them about the signs of an unhealthy relationship, but I think more importantly, the signs of what a healthy relationship should look like. What does respect look like in a relationship? What does equality look like in a relationship? And I think learning some of those components of what constitutes a healthy relationship is very helpful for young people to be able to identify even before they become involved in an unhealthy or potentially abusive relationship.
Commissioner, I want to speak to the issue of men, because we know that many times we're known to be the aggressor. But yet and still there is domestic violence that occurs even to men.
Yes, it's estimated nationally that about 95% of the victims of domestic violence are women, but 5%, anywhere from 5 to 8%, are men. There can be men that are abused in some of the ways that we alluded to, or men also in same-sex relationships.
73,000 home visits in 2008. That's from the New York Police Department's domestic violence unit, going out and investigating. When investigators go out, what kind of information are they pretty much looking to gather?
Well, when they're going out to do these home visits, that's actually officers following up after there has been a domestic violence incident. And these domestic violence prevention officers are in all of the precincts throughout the city, and they follow up on all these calls that we alluded to earlier, that almost 240,000 domestic incident reports that come to the attention of the New York City Police Department. But those visits are critical in letting both the victim know, asking whether the victim is okay, and letting them know what services are available, as well as letting the batterer know that the police are following up. And that's so important, because when we look at our homicides and we look at them, going back to 2002 all the way through 2008, in nearly 80% of the cases where there was a domestic violence related homicide, there was no prior contact with police. So clearly the police having contact and responding to incidents, and people calling the police when they need assistance, is clearly keeping people safer and keeping them alive. And obtaining an order of protection. Too many people will say,
And I want to look at that, because there is a number here about 87% no current protective order in 2009, and in 2008, 95%.
That's right. All too often we hear, well, is a piece of paper really going to keep me safe? And no, we unfortunately have had cases where people have been victims of a homicide when they had an order of protection. But you can see by the numbers that by and large, most of our homicide victims unfortunately did not have a current order of protection at the time of the homicide.
We want to tell you that you're watching Perspectives here as we do a special here on domestic violence.